So welcome everybody again. We are very fortunate we have the presence of Dan Cozort here with us, and we are exploring together ways that we can face and tame the climate and ecological crisis, or the many crises that are happening in the world right now. They are even named these days polycrisis. But we're going to be recording this session, and I am going to in a few moments pass the baton on to you, Dan. And you are on. So, Dan, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, or I can't hear you right now. Let's see.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. So hello again. It was a pleasure to be with you the week before last. And I went through several of the major points that I've been considering regarding the relevance of Buddhism to climate change. So I started off by saying that I think that there are three broad areas where Buddhism is relevant. First, in countering mistaken views. And secondly, in modeling ethical behavior, and finally, in promoting social resilience. So last week was mostly about countering mistaken views. And by that, we mean anything that is a view that separates us from each other and from the rest of nature, which is most views. Right? I mean, religions do this by propounding that we have something in us that does not change through time, namely our soul. And most of us betray that even if we're not religious, we actually do believe in even the essence of something within us that doesn't change over time either. And then we went on to several other points about this. And then I started to talk about modeling ethical behavior, and in particular talked about the value of non-harming, which would be a sufficient basis in itself, I think, for Buddhism to advance, a way of being that would change the planet. But there are other things to consider too. And today I wanted to go on with that and start talking about what's loosely called Buddhist economics. And so let me.
So you are the co-host.
It still says I can't. Oh, there we go. Okay. You can see this, right? Where it says Buddhist economics.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then I'll go on. I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Um, anyway, this is kind of a new term. For the last several decades, people have been thinking through what is the alternative to free market economics. All of us have lived with that system our whole lives, and we probably never think about any alternative. But, it's actually only a few centuries old, this thing we call capitalism. And it's only in the era after the Second World War that we've seen the whole world come to be dominated by it, including, China and Russia and Cuba, all of which used to proclaim themselves to be socialist states. The reason we're so concerned about economics is, as my friend Ben Fong would say, it's what drives the climate crisis. It's the ideology of perpetual growth, which requires not only tremendous strain on the planet, but that human beings be transformed into willing consumers. So if we're going to change minds, we have to help people see what the problem is with this. What Joanna Macy calls it's the industrial growth society, so that we can become a more life-affirming society. So Buddhist economics is a way of suggesting changes to tame capitalism, so economic life will lead to action against climate change, to happiness for a greater number of people, and eventually to liberation itself. So these are some facets of market economics that we're all familiar with, right? From the point of view of management, work is an expense to be reduced to a minimum. So we see automation wherever it's really possible. From the point of view of the worker, work is a necessary evil. If you can get paid more and work less, that's, what you would aim for. The quality of life is one that's characterized by consumption. The more you have, the more experiences you could buy, the better off you are. And finally, consumption must always increase. If consumption is flat, we say the economy is stagnant, we think something's terribly wrong, and we want to throw out of office whoever is responsible for this. Most of us think that every succeeding generation has to be better off than the last, an idea which is new in the history of human beings. Well, anyway, Buddhist economics says that all of these ideas are wrong. Work is good for us, and there should be a lot of it. Managers should hire as many people as they can. A good life is characterized by contentment, not consumption. And consumption needs to decrease, at least until we know how to provide energy and use our natural resources without killing the planet. Anyway, the basic problem with market economics is that it leads to delusion and greed. The fundamental delusion, as always, is that we are independent of others and complete in ourselves. While consumerism is driven by advertising, which plays on this. It emphasizes individuality. It promises that we can become the envy of others, which of course promotes greed. Capitalism is motivated by profit. Success is measured by ever increasing profits. That's virtually a definition of greed. And then to the extent that we identify as consumers, we're accepting greed as a way of life. So surveys show that we think that we need ever increasing amounts of money to be happy, and that we think we need ever increasing amounts of space, ever increasing personal property to be happy. Ever since they started measuring this, since the Second World War, every year people say they need more money, more space, more personal property. And I would also point out that virtually everything has been commodified. This is also an effect of capitalism. So land itself has a price, right? And the water and the minerals under the land, such as oil and natural gas and ore, can be sold separately from your property. You own them. Airspace is owned. Forests are owned. Fishing areas are owned. Animals, domesticated and hunted, are owned. And human time is a commodity because we can trade it by the hour for money. And human bodies, our kidneys, our eyes, our hearts, they all have a monetary value for transplant now. And as far as family patrimony is concerned, an inheritance used to mean that someone could carry on the family business and home. Now, it's investment capital that you can use to become independently wealthy, like the members of the Walmart family, whose father founded Walmart. And of course, market economics also promotes ill will, contempt for others. Many examples, executives behaving badly and either being rewarded for it or not being punished in any significant way, and many examples of exploitation of the natural resources and labor of other countries. The idea that we are separate and independent individuals has a corollary that if I become successful, it must be because I have worked hard. So unfortunately, this often leads to the conclusion that people who are not successful must be lazy. I've been reading a lot about why so many people are deeply resentful of those who benefit from poverty programs. And there's a story picked up from Ronald Reagan when he ran for president in 1980 and carried right through now to Trump and those who run for office with his approval, that there are many lazy welfare cheats. The picture is of a woman who was an infamous so-called welfare queen in Chicago and was convicted of fraud. Reagan told her story as though it was typical of welfare recipients. So anyway, in the United States, 52% of the American public believes that lack of motivation is a major cause of poverty, and 20% believe that the poor have lower moral values. So this makes a sizable number of people unwilling to pay for things that might enable poor people to rise out of poverty, such as child care, public transportation, rent control, the child tax credit. We can see this being played out in presidential politics. And then market economics also leads to other kinds of discontent, which I'm just labeling as fear. So it's made it much more difficult for many people, which can lead to worry and stress. So some examples are, if they move a factory, you have to move with the job, which disrupts families, or you get promoted, but you get promoted to another branch that's located in Hartford, Connecticut, or something like that. Um, People are afraid to change jobs because they might not be able to get a new one. Some jobs require an incredible number of hours in a kind of an initial hazing phase. Um, and then, factories and other businesses for that matter require now people to work at night or have to work constantly changing shifts just for the sake of the efficiency of the business. And then, of course, we know the political process is corrupted by business interests who fund political campaigns, which means, of course, that we come to distrust our fellow citizens and politicians, and we have an unhappier and more stressed society. I also want to mention something very basic that often doesn't get mentioned in this regard, which is that we're so concerned about our status. Um, we are animals who care very much about how we appear to others. So our egos drive us to get higher status, which within the United States and many other countries can be purchased with wealth. And we don't have any non-wealthy but high status aristocracy or caste. It's all based on wealth here. So status anxiety stems from the delusion regarding ourselves as separate from others in the environment. It's a different delusion than of greed, but it leads to greed. I think it's interesting to note that the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville studied the young United States of the 1830s, and in a chapter, Why the Americans Are So Often Restless in the Midst of Their Prosperity, he noted that the United States is the first society where you can't rely on the excuse of humble birth, because supposedly everybody here is equal and opportunities are endless. So it's your own fault if you don't get ahead. It's even more important than wealth, it's been found. Um, so surveys show that our happiness in a pay rise is diminished if all others also get the increases. In fact, we would prefer to get a pay cut if others got a greater pay cut. So it's all, how we stand in relation to others. Some recent examples, of East Germany, people's happiness increased after the fall of communism, but it evaporated when they compared themselves with West Germans. And for women, pay and opportunities in the late 20th century increased due to the women's movement. But when women started to compare themselves to men, they realized that they were still behind and became less happy than they were before. So one phrase that I like a lot is this one: the bronze medalist is happier than the silver medalist, because the silver medalist is envious of the gold medalist, but the bronze medalist realizes that he or she, is ahead of everybody in the world except for these two, right? It's so great. Anyway, we soon take our raised status for granted. If we get a dollar raise in income, then we soon feel that we need at least 40 cents more in required income to be happy. And I also wanted to look for a moment at a corner of the capitalist universe that's occupied by a relatively small but very powerful group that might be termed libertarians. So libertarians tend to believe that everyone has an equal chance to be successful. If other people are poor, it's because they're lazy. They feel that they should be able to do as much as whatever they like with their property and not have to support the moochers who are everywhere. They believe the free market will provide a better life for all who deserve it if it is left alone. In other words, if you lower taxes on the rich and let them, be more productive. I think the Buddha is the ultimate anti-libertarian, because the whole idea of karma is that we do not start off with a level playing field. We're highly determined by our birth, by our circumstances, and so forth. I put up a picture of Ayn Rand here, who was a Russian immigrant who wrote a few very popular novels of which you may be aware, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead especially, as well as essays where she spelled out her philosophy of objectivism. Anyway, she called for unfettered capitalism. And I don't want to go through this entire quote, but she actually wrote an essay called The Virtue of Selfishness, and concluded it whether any man of self-esteem should be required to give to others. And the answer is no, whereas altruism says yes. I mean, she just put it right out there, the selfish attitude of the wealthy libertarians. Anyway, getting back to capitalism, this is Ben Fong, who I referred to, I think, earlier. So I just wanted to consider something that he wrote that appeared in the New York Times, the capital of which was, "It's capitalism, stupid." He argued that the climate crisis is driven not by stupidity or ignorance, but by the economic system itself. He said, the overwhelming unintelligence involved in keeping the engines of production roaring when they are making the planet increasingly uninhabitable cannot be pinned on specific people. It is the system as a whole that is at issue. The intelligence of the brightest people around is no match for the rampant stupidity of capitalism. And what better example could be given maybe than of subsidizing fossil fuels? Government subsidies in many countries around the globe keep the price of gasoline and fossil fuels in general low to encourage, business expansion. It's enormous. You probably don't realize how enormous it is. The International Monetary Fund estimated it to be about $6 trillion per year, or about equal to 6.5% of global economic output. Much of this is hidden subsidy. It's by tax breaks, or simply that the health and environmental damage of burning fossil fuels is never included in the price that the rest of us pay. So for instance, 47% of natural gas and 99% of coal is priced at less than half of its true cost. If we talk about true cost, the true cost of a gallon of gasoline has been pegged at about $15 per gallon. Now just imagine if gasoline were $15 a gallon, what changes would that make in our life? Huge, right? Huge. We'd be demanding vehicles that could run on a fraction of what they currently cost to run, and it would cause people to want to be living in center cities and instead of suburbs, be doing a lot less commuting, and it would be enormous. Anyway, it's estimated that about a third of corporate profits are due to their ability to externalize costs this way. And since U.S. corporate profits are about $1.5 trillion a year, that means that about $500 billion is not being paid by corporations that they should be paying. So the general question here is there any way to tame all of this? Can corporations become enlightened? This was the title of an essay by David Loy. He's playing with the fact that in the United States law, corporations are actually considered persons. However, he notes, they're persons who can't become enlightened. They have no real location. They play locality and nation against each other. They have no body. They cannot live. They cannot suffer. They can't become enlightened because their charters prevent them from seeing that they're one with the world. And I put up here a picture of the Boston Tea Party. A few years ago, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then it spread to other places. Well, I think the Boston Tea Party was the first Occupy movement against a corporation, in this case, the British East India Company.
Dan, I just want to bring to your attention the time.
Yeah, okay, it's 11:10 already, and I'll go for 5 more minutes, okay? All right. So at this point, corporations are now a majority of the world's largest economies. So for instance, if you take Malaysia, its economy is slightly larger than Matsushita, but smaller than IBM, and Walmart itself is bigger than the economy of Belgium. 147 corporations own interlocking stakes of one another, and together control 40% of all the wealth in the world, and only 747, 80% of all the wealth in the world. And we know that they're often more powerful than governments and can buy them off. Now, the founders of the United States had a healthy fear of corporations after having been exploited for years by those in England, such as the East India Company. So in the early United States, the role of corporations was limited by granting only select corporate charters, and owners couldn't own any stock or property or make financial donations to a political party. But by the time of the American Civil War, corporations became wildly enriched, and with this new wealth came bribes to legislators and courts that allows for increased liability protection and other corporate protections. And that's why Abraham Lincoln said, corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow, and money power will endeavor to prolong its reign by working on the prejudices of the people until wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. He was right to fear what happened. In 1886, the Supreme Court recognized corporations as persons with First Amendment rights. And then we know in 2010, with the Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court ruled that political spending is a form of free speech that's protected under the First Amendment. So I would say that Abraham Lincoln's fear has never been more relevant than today. So Buddhist economics itself, it really begins, I think, with an essay written by E.F. Schumacher, later included in a collection called Small is Good, Economics as If People Mattered, which was very popular in the 1970s. His essay was actually written back in the 1950s when he worked, when he was an economic consultant to the government of Burma, which is, of course, a Buddhist country. So these were the major points of his essay. First of all, work matters because it builds character. It enables people to have full mindful engagement in a way that they rarely do in leisure time, except when they play certain types of games. And that it actually leads to less discontentment than leisure does often. Also, that one's basic needs, such as food, water, health, and education, must be met because poverty impedes enlightenment. Consumption be discouraged because, of course, it leads to delusion, ill will, and greed. And wealth inequality should be reduced because it supports a class system that feeds delusions about superiority. So Buddhist economics happens whenever there are ego-diminishing viewpoints, the recognition of interdependence, the acknowledgement of social capital, which means what we get from belonging to a society, and recognition of human rights and compassion, and so on. I'll just end with maybe this next one. It's been suggested that perhaps Buddhist economics is socialism. And yes, I think that's true, but we have to understand some things about socialism. It tends to socialism, but it would be satisfied with a better regulated and moderated capitalism. Socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Or regulated, I think, is a key term there, because that means that you could have a capitalism that's properly regulated. Anyway, our society is somewhere on the scale between pure socialism and pure capitalism. We have lots of things that are socialistic. We have Social Security and Medicare. We have public education, public police, fire, transportation. We have a public military and all the programs to aid the poor. European democracies exceed us in providing national health care pre-university guaranteed wages and benefits. But we are socialistic to some degree, and there are also within our society, there are major corporations that actually are owned and controlled by the workers themselves. Anyway, Buddhist economics tends to be socialistic, but really all Western democracies tend to be socialistic too, recognizing the faults in pure capitalism. So anyway, I'll stop there for today, and we could talk about things maybe a little bit and call it a day.
Thank you, Dan. Excellent, as always, so thought-provoking. And I'm going to stop the recording now.